As I said, I was instantly drawn by just the story of these four guys, the way they fought for each other. If you read the book, it is a harrowing, excruciating, blow-by-blow book of what they went through. But what you take away from it is these guys really were there for each other and sacrificed for each other, ultimately sacrificing their lives.
What I cared about and Nick cared about was that we told the story authentically and that we put the story in the hands of an exceptional filmmaker who could help tell the story of not just how these guys died, because that's well reported, but what they did to support one another, how they fought for one another, and putting it in the more than capable hands of Steven, who's one of the most acclaimed documentary filmmakers, on our planet, was a great choice.
And this was by far the most challenging, largest budget, biggest scale, most ambitious project I've ever been involved with, sports or non-sports. And I will say to Rick's point about it taking 16 years to get to this point, it would not have gotten to this point were it not for Rick absolutely relentlessly pounding the pavement and trying everything he could to get both the scripted film and the doc made.
To this day, that particular search and rescue effort is still their gold standard for never giving up hope, for believing against all odds that their job is important and that they can save lives. And they are so very proud of this. It's part of their training when you come into the United States Coast Guard now. They cite this as the case in which common sense would tell you that there's no way somebody could survive that. And it would be easy for them to just give up after a certain amount of time. And they didn't do that. And they are the real heroes of this story. Hi, this is Rick French, and we're on with Jason Stein and Cars and Culture.
Hi, I'm Steven Cantor, and this is Cars and Culture with Jason Stein.
What a pleasure to have both of you on the program here just ahead of the premiere in Tampa, Florida. Rick, welcome to the program again. Welcome back, I should say.
Thank you, Jason. It's great to be on with you.
Steven, welcome as well to you.
Thank you. Good to be here.
We have a lot to cover here, but I guess I want to start off with a brief summary of the story. And Rick, we had a involved conversation, probably almost 2 years ago. But I want to get into Four Down. And the trailer, by the way, it gives you goosebumps. I mean, the way that this has been put together. Steven, let's start off with you. Maybe a brief summary of the story of the documentary feature Four Down and really what it's meant to you.
Sure. In 2009, four friends went fishing off the coast of Florida in the Gulf of Mexico. They were two NFL guys, two NFL players, Marquise Cooper and Corey Smith, both Tampa Bay Bucks at one point, and two friends of theirs, a trainer named Nick Schuyler and his best friend Will Blakely. They all went fishing off the coast of Florida, and they were 75 miles out, and the storm of the century was coming the next day. They knew a big storm was coming, and when it got time to go home, the anchor was stuck in the water. And rather than cut the anchor, which would have cost a few $100, they made the unfortunate decision to try and rev the engine and try and pull the anchor up. And in revving the engine, the boat capsized, bow over stern, and all four guys were thrown into the water. The storm of the century unfortunately came. They were not able to flip the boat, so the storm came and hit them really hard. And over the course of the next 43 hours, three of them perished. The two NFL players perished fairly quickly in the first night, and Will and Nick hung on through the first night, and Will unfortunately perished the second night, and Nick survived the 43 hours, was rescued by the Coast Guard in a dramatic, heroic rescue mission. And he lived to tell the story.
what is it that drew you to the story?
It's really an epic story of friendship and survival and brotherhood and the way they struggled together to fight for each other's lives and the sacrifices they made along the way were really inspirational. I think everybody hopes to have friends that will have their back the way these guys did for each other. So I think that was really the main compelling thing.
What led you to the story? I guess when did you first hear about it, and maybe explain the connection to Rick as well.
Sure. Some producer friends, David Coe and Stanley Buckthall, had optioned the documentary rights to the story from Rick and Nick, and had been trying to make a documentary for some time when they took it to me. And as I said, I was instantly drawn by just the story of these four guys, the way they fought for each other. If you read the book, it is a harrowing, excruciating, blow by blow book of what they went through. But what you take away from it is these guys really were there for each other and sacrificed for each other, ultimately sacrificing their lives.
Rick, you and I talked a couple of years ago on this program. We talked a lot about culture and the impact that filmmaking and storytelling can have on culture. And I know you've been drawn to this entire story for quite some time. Give us a little bit of your perspective, a refresher for the audience, if you would.
Sure. So Nick's family reached out to me just days after the accident. So this was early March of 2009. They were besieged with national media requests, everyone wanting to know exactly what happened, especially when you have two NFL players who were involved. And there was a little bit of kind of online conspiracy theory going on where people were asking the question of, well, why did he live and why did the others perish, almost blaming the survivor. And it just felt to me at the time that it was extremely unfair, and the family needed some help in fielding the number of requests. And so we had an associate in our Tampa office who was friends with Nick and his family, and so the family reached out and asked if we would get involved. And after some conversations, I said, yeah, we would do that. And that started this journey. And it kind of segued to telling the original story on HBO Real Sports with Bryant Gumbel, an incredibly powerful opening season segment. And after that aired, not only did they receive Emmy nominations for it, but book publishers and studios, began calling. And we decided, Nick and I sat down and said, look, you could do an interview as we did with Real Sports in 22 minutes and discuss this. But if you want to give the full narrative just once and for all about kind of what happened out there, let's look at doing the book. And so we paired Nick with Jerry Longman, who was a well-respected sports journalist and writer, to write Not Without Hope. That became a New York Times bestseller, went to the top, led to Oprah Winfrey special and his appearance on morning shows and evening shows with Larry King and so on. And from there it just kind of grew, and that began the journey of the book. I should back up, was published 1 year after the anniversary of Nick's rescue. And really then from there, studios began calling, and we've gone through this development process with both For Noun and Not Without Hope. So there's obviously a feature version of the film also coming out later this year. And what I cared about and Nick cared about was that we told the story authentically, and that we put the story in the hands of a exceptional filmmaker who could help tell the story of not just how these guys died, because that's well reported, but what they did to support one another, how they fought for one another, and putting it in the more than capable hands of Steven, who's one of the most acclaimed documentary filmmakers, on our planet, was a great choice.
And Steven, as Rick says, the much of the motivation that goes in here, and I know what you tried to portray was how the family members really refused to give up hope, and that the Coast Guard was able to actually find Nick alive, and they did that because they refused to quit. And I'm sure that was an inspiring part of what led you to this. What else did you learn in this journey, Stephen?
Yeah, the family, we talked to all of Nick's family members, and they were all deeply, deeply emotional. And just the slightest question was opening up a really raw wound for them. Like, I don't think this is something you ever recover from, even though their son and brother survived. Um, it was a harrowing. I mean, actually, I think they almost lend the emotional spine to this story because they are just so emotional and open about what they went through. And it was so terrifying, 43 hours not knowing what happened to Nick. And then to discover that he survived after that much time at sea. So we had actors portray the family members. We didn't have the family members play themselves. We hired actors to portray the family members. And actually, the actors resemble and physically resemble and emotionally really pulled off a good performance of being the family members, but the family members are telling their own story. So the actors never speak. And the family member stories are pretty harrowing.
When did you first start to work on the film?
About 3 years ago, David and Stanley and Rick and I teamed up, and it's been a long development process figuring out how we're going to tell the story and getting Nick to feel comfortable to tell the story again, and figuring out the way that we're going to recreate. Sometimes recreations in documentaries can get a little cheesy, and we definitely did not want to get anywhere near that for this. This was such a such a vital story. It had to be done in a really high end,
Yeah. Rick, it's been more than 15 years since the accident and the rescue. Why did you feel now is the right time to tell the story?
I think had we told the story in the immediate aftermath of the accident, there would have been a lot of raw emotions, but there wouldn't be a lot of perspective. And I think that the time has allowed perspectives to be formed. Nick to recover to the extent that someone can ever recover from this kind of a situation. The family members to look back. Their lives have gone on and things have evolved, and they can look back at how fortunate they were and how much sacrifice was made by those that lost their lives, as well as the Coast Guard, has had many search and rescue missions since Nick's rescue. But they'll be the first one to tell you, and this we talk about this in the documentary. To this day, that particular search and rescue effort is still their gold standard for never giving up hope, for believing against all odds that their job is important and that they can save lives. And they are so very proud of this. It's part of their training when you come into the United States Coast Guard now. They cite this as the case in which common sense would tell you that there's no way somebody could survive that. And it would be easy for them to just give up after a certain amount of time. And they didn't do that. And they are the real heroes of this story. Nick is a survivor, but the Coast Guard members who risked their lives to go out on boats, in airplanes and helicopters, as Steven said, in the storm of the century, refusing to give in. And as a result of their heroism, Nick was found alive. And so I think that the 15 years has given everybody a real perspective on all of that. And hopefully it's also allowed some wounds to heal for some of the other family members and so on. It just would have been too soon, too quick to tell this story earlier than telling it now.
And how much convincing was there with Nick? Was he willing to participate, or Rick, did you have to?
He was, we always talked about making a film. The book was um, it was such a well-read book and well-reviewed book that we knew that there was a high degree of likelihood that it would evolve into some sort of film. And it's been a long journey with both projects. I think that Nick was always willing, but not eager, if that makes sense.
Mhm.
Having to relive this, it's easier for him, I believe, in the feature film because you can disassociate yourself from the well-known actor, in our case, Zachary Levi, who plays him in Not Without Hope. But when you have to sit down for a documentary where you're on camera and you're telling the story again in first person, that was not easy. And he was always willing, but he was never eager. And as we got close to the filming and the start date of this, I think there was some dread on his part because you're having to go back and relive something that was the most, horrific experience of your life.
Steven, your view on working with Nick?
Um, I think he was remarkably, I would actually say the entire family was remarkably open. I think they made the decision they're going to make this film, and once they made that decision collectively, by the time it got to me, they had committed to it, and no question was going to be too hard. There was no, I didn't have to soft pedal anything. I could really, like, the way the audience would connect with it would be for me to ask the really difficult emotional questions, and they all understood that, and that's what we did. And there was no point where Nick did not want to answer a question or did not tell a story in all of its excruciating horror.
Wow. What was that like for you emotionally, Steven?
Um, well, I was I was on vacation with my daughter, my family, and my daughter wanted me to go into a pool with her. The heater in the pool was broken, so the pool was at maybe 74 degrees or something, which was pretty cold. And I was thinking, I should be a good dad and jump in there with her. And I was like, all right, maybe just 15 minutes. And I got in the 74-degree pool for 15 minutes, and I couldn't make it. I couldn't make it 9 minutes. And Rick was in, I mean, these guys were in much colder water than that with a storm for 43 hours. And I kept thinking about that, like the unbelievable cold they must have felt, and the horror of hypothermia and dehydration. So um, it was emotional talking to Nick. It was, it's your worst nightmare. If you read the book or see the movie, but really read the book and page by page, just get the excruciating craziness that they went through out there for 43 hours in freezing water and with freezing air and with no food and salt water. I mean, it was crazy what they went through. So,
Wow.
And Jason, I'll add something here. After probably 6 months after Nick's rescue, when we first did the HBO Real Sports piece, Bernie Goldberg was doing the interview, and he asked Nick to walk to the edge of the uh, Tampa Bay and just kind of reflect on it. And I remember this vividly. Nick walked to the edge of the water and he put his feet in what at that time, we were shooting this in August, was a very warm Tampa Bay. But to Nick, when he put his feet in the water, it felt ice cold. His psychology was that water, he associated a pool water with just bitter cold, and it was extraordinarily difficult. He had to step back out of the water and he'd grown up in Florida. He'd grown up, yeah, I mean, he grew up in Ohio, but had moved to Florida, lived there a long time. Water was a part of the essence of what was his everyday life. But putting his feet in the water was a very difficult experience. For the longest time, he could not go out on a boat. It was PTSD. And so I think that for him to do this documentary and relive some of those moments was really, really difficult. And you feel it in the conversation with him as Steven takes you through the story. And it takes a hell of a lot of courage to sit down and talk about these things again when all you really want to do is move on with your life and not be defined by an accident that took three of your close friends and your very best friend. But I give him all the props in the world for being willing to sit down and tell the story and try to honor their memories.
Steven, from a director's point of view, how do you capture what Rick just described, the emotions and specifically with Nick and perhaps with family members of those who did not survive or those involved with search and rescue as well, without crossing a line or perhaps digging too deeply?
That was the hardest part of making the film. Once we had the interviews, we sort of knew the core of what we needed to then go dramatize. And we had actors who resembled who were, actually had to be great swimmers also and had to resemble the guys because it was a documentary. So we didn't want them to be too far off physically. So it was, first of all, a hard casting process. And second of all, once we had the cast, the five of us spent a lot of time together going through what the emotion of it all would be. And then we filmed on a tank in the Dominican Republic, a tank studio. So you're in a controlled water environment, and then there's the ocean in the background. And we had wave machines and underwater divers and underwater cinematographers and all kinds of lights and smoke machines and wind machines. It was almost like making a Michael Bay movie or something. So there's a lot actually going around. And these guys had to focus on their emotional performance, and they weren't, really seasoned actors. They were more chosen for their physical swimming abilities, and they're looking like the characters. So it was a really intense thing for all five of us to get to this emotional place. For them, I know they felt a big responsibility to be representing the guys' last moments and to make sure they were doing justice to the men that they were and the sacrifices they made and the struggle they all went through.
And interviewing family members of those who did not survive must have been an enormous challenge.
We didn't go there. We decided to let them rest in peace and not to open that wound. The whole film is pretty much a reliving of the 43 hours of Nick's survival. From Nick's point of view, the Coast Guard's point of view, and all of his family members' point of view. There's sort of you jump back and forth between those three different perspectives.
Got it.
They're all filmed differently. And I will say, to Rick's point about the Coast Guard was, and to some extent, this really makes the film. The Coast Guard was so proud of their rescue efforts in this that they gave us access to all of their crew and all of their access. We basically had the run of the Coast Guard base for 3 days, unless there was actual search and rescue missions that they were called on. So we had all kinds of Coast Guard members and access to planes and boats, and it was amazing. It was almost, for those seasons, it almost feels like a Paul Greengrass movie, like United 97 or something like that. Like, you are following Coast Guard members. They're running down the docks and storms at night. And then sometimes they were actually going on search and rescue missions and letting our cameras come with them.
Wow.
Yeah, those scenes are really intense.
And Rick? Jason, I think had we chosen to go there with the families, we would have needed the participation of all of the families. You couldn't just have one or two families represented in this. You need to balance it. And Will's family has had some unfortunate tragedy with his siblings, and his parents have dealt with some health issues. I think that we just looked at this and said, it's it would be such a raw experience for them to to ask them to participate in this. And in the past, we've spoken with them, and while they respect the process and the book and the story, they don't want to relive it themselves, a death of a loved one. And so what we try to do is we try in ways in the film to honor their memory and bring them back to life in a different kind of way, but without really wanting to reopen the wounds for them.
Rick, in the history of things that you've been a part of, where does Four Down fit emotionally, psychologically, from a
I can answer
satisfaction
that.
standpoint?
Single greatest thing he's ever been involved with in his entire life.
I,
He has changed his life. He will never be the same.
Yes, 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 yes. How about even culturally, Rick? I mean,
that there is a little truth to what Steven said. He's made a remarkable film that made me cry as I watched it. I don't know if it was uh, 15 years of my life coming coming to the screen there in terms of the experience of trying to tell the story and get it made, both in terms of the feature film and the doc. But what I would tell you is that there's a little bit of relief, there's a little bit of trepidation. How will the film be received? Because in any film, you're putting it out there for people to evaluate it. I think that all you can do is trust the process and trust it in the hands of somebody like Steven, who's made some of the best documentaries, and especially in the sports world, that have ever been produced. And so I'm looking forward to it, but in an unusual way. This is a sad story. This is not a rom-com. It's not something that where you can go there and celebrate the fact that you're releasing a movie. This is a difficult story to tell, and so all I care about is that we've respected the creative process and that we've respected the wishes of all the people involved, and try to tell the story in the most authentic way we can and let others decide how they want to view it.
Steven, just to back up what Rick has said here, whether it was Chasing Tyson or Citizen Ash, even more recently Hood River, about a high school soccer team in a small Oregon community. You've been a part of numerous sports themed films. Where does this fit for you in the lexicon of what you've been a part of?
And this was by far the most challenging, largest budget, biggest scale, most ambitious project I've ever been involved with, sports or not sports. And I will say, to Rick's point about it taking 16 years to get to this point, it would not have gotten to this point were it not for Rick absolutely relentlessly pounding the pavement and trying everything he could to get both the scripted film and the doc made. And there was one point where we're pitching it. It was, it's a complicated environment right now out there. It's hard to pre-sell documentaries to streaming platforms. And there was one point where it was getting complicated for us. And I just had in the back of my mind, there is no way this film is not getting made with Rick, because he was so relentless in pursuing both films getting made. And particularly the documentary, I think he felt a responsibility. He made a promise to Nick that he's going to get this film made, and that promise was being fulfilled. So,
well, thank you, and thank you for agreeing to take it on, because you can make a film, you can make it, you get it made, but getting it made with somebody like Steven, who is so acclaimed, and that was critical. It wasn't just getting either film made. Joe Carnahan is well-respected director who produced the feature film. I've been blessed to have two of the great filmmakers in the world tackle the subject matter here. and they've both done it with compassion and authenticity. And I think that at the end of the day, this is a documentary that is going to stay with you for a long time. You're never going to forget it when you've watched it, because um, we take you places, we take you into that water with those guys. We take you, on the boat, in the helicopter. You have the feeling that you are reliving this too. It's immersive. I I I don't know if down the road we'll end up doing any sort of theatrical with this, or if it'll end up, in streaming. There's been talks with distributors about both. I can tell you that if by chance we ever do a theatrical and were to take this into something like IMAX, I think it would maybe be the most unsettling thing for the viewers, because you are thrown into that water with them, and you feel the horror. And it's tough enough watching it on a big screen television. I can't imagine what it would be like to watch it in an IMAX, and what some of the people who will be at our premiere are going to feel when they're watching this on the big screen.
Stephen, you've been a part of so many things, so many different subjects, whether it was Willie Nelson or the dating life of Lisa Loeb, singer, um, or What Remains, which was studying what happens to the human body and its as it becomes one with nature. Anything in the automotive space you've been a part of?
Uh, I made a series about Henrik Lundqvist, the Rangers goalie, and we had Jeff Gordon. This pops to mind.
Yeah, you've been on this program.
Jeff Gordon was a guest on our Henrik Lundqvist show, and the idea was that Henrik was a hockey goalie, for those who don't know.
Yeah.
And Jeff took Henrik on a sort of crazy car tour, NASCAR tour, put him in the car and drove him around, as only Jeff can do, 120 miles an hour.
Yes.
And Henrik thought couldn't turn his head backwards and thought his eyes were going to pop out of his head. That was a really amazing day.
I've been in the car when Jeff has been driving a Ferrari, and it will put the eyes in the back of your head.
Yeah. His Pepsi commercials are amazing. I love those.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. Not too much car stuff, but that was definitely one highlight. He took me for a ride too. So
the film premieres April 24th at the Sunscreen Film Festival in St. Petersburg, Florida. I'm guessing that Sunscreen was selected due to the proximity of the accident. Is that right?
Partially that, and I'd say largely the fact that the Coast Guard base where we filmed is there, and we wanted the Coast Guard. They were so generous. They charged us $0 for access to all of the assets, all the planes, all the boats, all the personnel. There's no actors. It's all real Coast Guard members recreating the search and rescue mission. So we felt, and they all have been bugging us about when do we get to see the film, and we thought they should see it on a big screen, in a premiere environment with a reception afterwards that they can all participate in. It's very emotional for them too, especially the ones that live through it.
I can imagine. Yeah.
And the fact
a lot of Coast Guard members will be present.
They will. And Nick's family and Nick himself are still in the Tampa area. So we did feel that having our premiere there, yes, we could have held it and gone to any number of other festivals. That would make it feel like a movie, as opposed to doing it in St. Pete, where it's very much about the story and trying to have a cathartic experience, and letting people who were part of this all come together and see each other again, which would not have been possible if we had premiered this, pick your festival. So it was very strategic in terms of the choice of the festival. And the Sunscreen Film Festival is an Oscar qualifying festival. They premiere really some great films there that have a Florida association in some way. So it just felt right to do it there. I'm very pleased with the choice that we made. And I do think that having so many of the Coast Guard members who actually participated in the search and rescue, and those that have just heard about it over years and years of their training, and having everybody come together along with Nick will be a really special experience.
An interesting thing
Indeed.
about a premiere is, I mean, it really is a premiere for the filmmakers too. Like, you don't know how the film is going to play in front of an audience until that night. And it's always kind of a nerve-wracking, anxious situation, but this one is doubly anything I've ever been involved with. You know, when you're dealing with chasing Tyson or a boys soccer team or whatever, you hope that the parents and the kids love the film, or that Evander Holyfield feels proud of it or whatever. But this feels like, first of all, it is a harrowing film to watch. Second of all, we really want the family members and Nick to feel like we did justice to their story and paid adequate tribute to the guys who perished. So there's pressure and excitement, and sort of everybody's on edge about how this film's going to play in a theater, and also just watching something with a crowd like that. You know, you never know if people are going to be like looking at their phones and walking out halfway through, or on the edge of their seat, leaning forward and holding their breath, which I think and hope will be the case for this one. I think it's going to be really intense.
We had a screening, Jason, in Los Angeles among the filmmakers and some close friends, and we did it in a screening room. Probably the first. This was an early cut of the film that was it Octoberish, somewhere in that range, I think it was, and we all sat there with some really well-respected filmmakers, studio executives, people who really understand the business. And I remember looking around as this thing we were going through the story. We had boxes of Kleenex that were there, and I kept watching people grab for Kleenex all over the place. And these are people who are pretty hardened to the movie making process, and emotionally, everyone left that screening spent.
Powerful.
Yeah, it's intense.
The two of you have some great partners involved with the film. How did Mark Wahlberg? He was our first guest here on this program. How did Mark Wahlberg and Snoop Dogg get involved?
I could take Snoop.
Yeah.
My company and Snoop's company have a long-standing relationship. We've done a lot of collaborations together. He's pitched us projects and vice versa, and he's been following the story and anxious to see it. And we showed him an early rough cut, and he just loved it and wanted to put his name on it and see if he could be helpful in spreading the word. He's an athlete. His son was a football player, and he's just very connected to the story. And so he's come on board as a supporting executive producer to see if he can amplify the film and see how he can be helpful. And Mark's been involved way before I even got involved. Mark's been involved. You could take that one, Rick, because
Sure. So it's really a full circle moment with Mark, because he and his production company were the first people that we optioned the book to back in 2010. And Mark had the intention of playing Nick. And his closest to the whole production at that time, one of his production shingles, optioned the project. What happened was, it was 2010, and Mark had two major projects come out that year, The Fighter and Ted, both which were huge commercial successes and critical successes as well. And it was one of those things where he just had difficulty kind of getting to it, to develop it alongside myself and the other parties at the time. And so some time had lagged, and he just got overcommitted with the projects, and we're going to have to push back the shoot schedule for a while. And so we agreed, hey, there was an opportunity at that time to bring Dwayne Johnson on board to play Nick, and have it set up in a major studio. And so things just kind of progressed, and then the studio ran into financial problems before it could ever get made. and uh, the rights got entangled legally and so on. And so we just kind of moved on. And so Mark and his team have always kind of checked in and expressed an interest in how they could be involved. And when as we got further along in the process, and Stephen went back to Mark and started talking to him about his involvement, it was a quick, yeah, I've always been passionate about this story, and that's kind of how Mark got back involved. So it's interesting that 15 years ago he expressed an interest in the story, and here we are 15 years later about to premiere it, and he's been back involved with us.
Also, coincidentally, the company that backed the film, both financially and creatively, it's a company called Gala. They have a relationship with both Mark and Snoop. So, and they're doing projects together as well.
And they were a big help in helping facilitate the deals to bring both on board. They've been great partners to us in getting the film financed. And we should add here that they financed a documentary at a budget level that I don't think has ever been approached before. And they were willing to put up large amounts of money, almost feature film budgets, to allow us to do these recreations and tell the story. And as Stephen mentioned earlier, that took a lot of a lot of conviction that this was a story worth telling, because what we didn't have available to us was those 43 hours. They went out, and there weren't any cameras. Their cell phones didn't work. They certainly weren't doing selfies of themselves out there.
Right.
So, we had to go out and do these recreations. And in order to pull that off, you needed a financier who was willing to go where no financier had ever gone before in the documentary space. So we owe them a huge debt of gratitude for taking the risk on the film.
Rick, just a couple more things. How will the film Not Without Hope be different than this?
Well, obviously, you're exploring the same subject matter, but the difference in documentary, as Stephen mentioned earlier, is that any of the actors, they don't have any dialogue. We're telling it in the voices of the people who actually lived through it in first person, whereas in the feature film, you have actors, well-known actors, who are dramatizing what took place. It's different in that the feature film, there's the linear build all the way through the story, and there's a lot of things happening on land as well with the family members that you are dramatizing of each of the families. And so I think that while you're exploring similar subject matter, the stories are different, and they complement one another really well. And I think that the feature film is a big, big motion picture, and I expect it to have a wide global release here in the fall. And I think that the documentary will help set the stage for it in some ways through the first person to really understand it. And once you've seen the documentary, hopefully you'll say, man, I want to see more of this. I want to see how Joe and the team, and Zachary Levi and Josh Duhamel and Joe Beth Williams, and the incredible cast that we had in that film, how they treat each of the roles. And making both of these projects has been an emotionally draining experience. You asked me the question earlier, how does it compare to everything else? I can tell you that I've made some other movies and have been involved in other projects, and have another one that's about to go into production. But I'm certain that none of them will be as deeply important to me or as emotionally draining as making either one of these projects, because again, a tough subject matter to deal with. There is a happy ending in that Nick was found alive, but I don't know that will ever substitute for the lives lost and how you feel about that part of it. And so I'm I'm anxious for both to be released. I'm anxious for you know, the audiences to tell us what they think. I think we've done a really good job on both, and we've done everything we can to respect their memories.
The film premieres April 24th at the Sunscreen Film Festival in St. Petersburg, Florida. Steven Cantor, Rick French, thank you so much for sharing your emotional story of the documentary that is to come, and we look forward to seeing Four Down on various platforms and in various ways. Thank you for telling the story.
Thank you, Jason. Appreciate you having us on.
Yep.
Great.
Thanks for
Thank
having
you.
us.